have to wait.
So one summer day a few years ago, I happened to be perusing Facebook, and a former partner posted a video and a subsequent rant about a controversy that somehow involved a Black transgender woman and a well-known figure in the hip-hop industry. The video that they posted featured two Black transgender women, Janet Mock and Laverne Cox. Various statements made by both women throughout the conversation prompted me to ask myself several questions, including, why do they keep saying trans women of color when they are both Black trans women? How are Black transgender women currently represented in media? Whose narratives are presented? To what extent do the narratives and subjectivities of Laverne Cox and Janet Mock represent all Black transgender women in media? Who do these representations exclude? And how are other Black trans women using media to tell their narratives? These questions prompted me to conduct an investigation into the ways in which transgender women of color are currently represented in media. My investigation revealed a great deal of nuance, complication, negotiation, sadness, and even laughter at some moments. Overall, I conclude that the current media representation of transgender women of color situate them to be part of one of two groups, either the respectable trans woman of color or the subhuman trans woman of color. Specifically, I argue that mass media working collaboratively with Janet Mock and Laverne Cox create narratives of trans women of color that employ a compulsory appeal to respectability politics in order to situate them as individuals worthy of incorporation into heteronormative society. At the same time, the media also situates transgender women of color who do not appeal to respectability politics as subhuman and thus unworthy of incorporation into the American social fabric. I want to briefly touch upon a point which I expand upon in greater detail in the larger paper, that starting in the 1950s, the mass media, established what would become the standard by which it would measure a transgender person in order to evaluate if this person was indeed a, quote, good transsexual. The story of Christine Jorgensen became the basis for the creation of this standard in an article by historian Emily Skidmore, which brilliantly examines the mass media's coverage of Jorgensen. Skidmore ultimately concludes that the success of Jorgensen's narrative relied on her deployment of respectability politics, which emphasized her embodiment of norms of white womanhood, notably through domesticity, middle-class decorum, allegiance to heterosexuality, and a strategic distancing and disapproval of homosexuality. Turning our attention back to the present day, an interrogation into how Janet Mock and Laverne Cox perpetuate what Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham calls the politics of respectability is necessary in order to explain the problematic nature of the media's over-reliance on the narratives and images of these women. I focus on Mock and Cox because both women have come to represent trans women of color communities on a national and international level through their consistent presence across various mass media outlets. Further, their presence in the media is important because of the media's tendency to use Mock and Cox as not only representative of Black trans women, but of all trans women of color, Asian, Black, and Latina included. Such representation politics are problematic in that they do not allow space for a nuanced representation of the particular experiences that Asian and Latina trans women face on a daily basis, in addition to assuming that all Black transgender women have the same experiences. Cultural studies scholar and theorist Stuart Hall discusses the stakes of representation in the media in a way in which representation is multifarious in order to promote, quote, new kinds of knowledges in the world, new kinds of subjectivities are explored, and new dimensions of meaning which have been foreclosed by the systems of power which are in operation, end quote. Hall also reminds us that while representation allows for new knowledge, it also carries with it a binary structure, which simultaneously creates new knowledge about various subjectivities, while also diminishing the complexity that exists amongst those who share a similar subjectivity. With regard to trans women of color, the stakes of representation are very high because new kinds of subjectivities have the opportunity to be explored. It is also important to acknowledge the gravity of what Mock and Cox's regular presence in media signifies in a nation where racist and transphobic violence continue to become a commonplace occurrence. Thinking back to the early 2000s, I can't imagine that the mass media would provide transgender women, let alone trans women of color, with an opportunity to share their stories, talents, and contributions in a way that was not always already motivated by a desire to further stigmatize or exploit those within the community. Similarly to Jorgensen in the 50s, Cox and Mox constantly and ardently strive to situate, naturalize, and make legible their femininity to dominant heteronormative society. During a panel discussion with Mark Lamont Hill in response to the news about DJ Mr. C, who I acknowledged earlier, Mock said, quote, "I refuse to take on any man's issues about my identity, about who I am. I am a woman. I happen to have been a born boy, and that's just what it is," end quote. By refusing to debate her identity as a woman, Mock and also Cox, who agreed with Mock, set the boundaries for the conversation about their identity in a way that naturalizes their womanhood as something that need not be questioned or debated. This is a especially important assertion in that by claiming ownership over their identity as women and journey to womanhood, they forcefully challenge heteronormative conceptions of the category of women, the ontological underpinnings upon which it operates, and ultimately the exclusion of women of trans experience from the category of women. During the discussion, both women underscore their heterosexuality. At one point, Mock said, quote, "Men are attracted to women," end quote, while Cox chimed in and asserted, quote, "Men are going to be attracted to me," end quote, thus erasing the fact that not all men are attracted to women, among several other obvious omissions. By repeatedly asserting that men are attracted to women, Cox and Mock distance themselves from the idea that their identity as trans women provide the impetus for them to have a sexual orientation that falls outside of heterosexuality. Mock and Cox's ability to distance themselves from the idea that their gender identity, understood to be deviant in the eyes of dominant society, also impacts their sexual orientation, which was essential to the establishment of their heteronormative identity, as many people continue to conflate gender identity and sexual orientation. The physical appearance of Janet Mock and Laverne Cox are also significant in the creation of their narratives for public consumption. Although the media has focused on the narratives of both women, it has specifically focused on the physical beauty of Janet Mock. Marie Claire magazine described Mock as having a, quote, "enviable career, supportive man, and a fabulous head of hair," end quote, where the Telegraph acknowledged her, quote, "undoubtedly good looks and glamorous background." Cox approaches her own physical appearance with a critical eye that explains her insecurity about her appearance. During a conversation, a dialogue with Bell Hooks, Cox asks, quote, "Am I feeding into the patriarchal gaze with my blonde wigs?" End quote. After Hooks quickly says yes, Cox defends her actions by saying, "It is one of those things where I'm sort of here, where I'm sort of like, here I am. If I'm embracing a patriarchal gaze with this presentation, it's a way that I found something that feels empowering. And I think the really honest answer is that I've sort of constructed myself in a way that I don't want to disappear. I've never been interested in being invisible and erased. So a lot of how I'm negotiating these systems of oppression and trying to not to be erased is perhaps by buying into and playing into some of the patriarchal gaze and white supremacy, end quote. By wearing blonde wigs and high heels, Cox gains attention of the media through her public image in a way that is similar to other famous Black women and familiar to the public. As Cox understands that her relationship to womanhood is often contested, she conspicuously employs symbols of respectability in a way that would lead many women to identify with her, even if they approach her with some hesitation. In doing so, Cox's nuanced and complicated negotiation with patriarchy and white supremacy lessens the likelihood that her narrative, identity, and contributions will be erased or forgotten by the public. Social media is a unique form, different from other forms of media in that it enables the user to narrate their own experiences to a larger audience without the assistance of trained media professionals. Such access enables trans women of color, specifically Black trans women, T.S. Madison, to present the nation and the world with an alternative narrative about the beliefs and attitudes and experiences of trans women of color, trans women of color to the one that the mass media presents with the help of Janet Mock and Laverne Cox. My initial introduction to T.S. Madison came by way of her provocative use of the social media outlet Vine.
No way, 22 inches, yes. Hi, boo.
Madison's decision to expose her entire body demonstrates a high level of comfortability with her gender, regardless of how transgressive other people might perceive it to be. In another video, she mocks those who have watched her previous videos and commented negatively about her penis, to which she responds to the video, "Yes, motherfuckers, a dick," as she swings her dick from side to side. In addition to her transgressive social media presence as a trans woman of color, T.S. Madison continues to participate and produce pornographic films where she does not simply receive a cisgender man's penis into her various orifices, as is the case in many normative pornographic films that involve women. Instead, Madison often directs and tells other performers how to pleasure her. She often makes other cisgender men in her scenes at the bottom, or the receptive partner, and she uses her penis to enjoy sexual acts that cisgender men in pornography often enjoy, including, but not limited to, fellatio, intercourse, and ejaculation on another performer's face. By engaging in such sex acts as a trans woman of color, Madison disrupts and transgresses existing cultural scripts assigned to women writ large. In his book, Butch Queens Up in Pumps, Gender Performance and Ballroom Culture in Detroit, Marlon and Bailey discusses the concept of realness and defines it as a quotidian form of performance that offers a way to understand all genders and sexual identities are performed. Later, Bailey precisely asserts that to be real is to minimize or eliminate any sign of deviation from gender norms that are dominant in heteronormative society. Using this definition of realness, T.S. Madison would not be considered real due to her non-compliance with heteronormative gender and sexual norms. Although many people who would see her in public would not immediately assume this by heteronormative standards, that she's a transgender woman, Madison makes few strategic attempts to de-emphasize or eliminate the discontinuity between her gender identity and sex assigned at birth.
Wait a minute, is it on? Now, wait a minute, bitch. On today's episode of Now Wait a Minute, Bitch, honey, I got a little rant that I gotta get off the chest, child. I live way in the great state of Atlanta, Georgia, child, and the children put me on an airplane and flew me all the way from Atlanta to California. Well, I tiptoed to the front, child, and I pulled my ID out, and every time I do, honey, I get these eyes get this big like saucers, child. And I'm like, well, honey, what the hell are you looking at? You ain't never seen a bitch named Timothy?
Madison's question illustrates the extent to which she is not concerned with the disparities between her gender identity, sex assigned at birth, and the disruption of gender norms in a manner which both truncates her ability to be real and distinguishes her from other trans women of color, including Mock and Cox. So as not to ignore the other representation that trans women of color, that the media purports of trans women of color, several cases illustrate the subhuman constructions and subject position of trans women of color. One I'll mention is the case of Zella Ayane, who was murdered as a result of her male friend's embarrassment about the details about their relationship becoming public. According to witnesses, Zayane's friend became enraged by her flamboyant behavior towards him while they were amongst his friends. So he shot her in the head and groin. In this case, Zayane's flamboyance as a trans woman of color, especially in the company of her murderous friends, was enough to justify her murder. And in conclusion, I think it's important that we look through all of these examples and sift through the complexities of representation, respectability, and subhumanity. And thus, I'm appealing to what the Combahee River Collective said, that if black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of systems of oppression, end quote. In taking their assertion a step further, I hope this paper concludes that it makes clear that everyone else can be free only when trans women of color, and especially black trans women, are free. Thanks.